Before we dive in, viewer discretion is advised. This content is for entertainment purposes.
What happens when a Hollywood icon who has survived 6 decades in the spotlight decides she's had enough of being ambushed on live television? What unfolds when an 86-year-old legend with nothing left to prove faces off against a talk show host armed with tabloid accusations and zero preparation? You're about to witness one of the most explosive, unfiltered, and absolutely devastating verbal demolitions in daytime television history. A moment so intense, so brutal, that it left Joy Behar looking like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear forever. This wasn't just another awkward interview moment. This wasn't a simple disagreement between host and guest. What you're about to read is the story of how Fonda, a woman who has stared down studio executives, hostile prosecutors, and angry mobs, systematically dismantled Joy Behar's credibility in front of millions of viewers. By the time the cameras cut to commercial, Joy sat frozen in her chair, her face drained of color, her confidence shattered, while Fonda walked off the set with her dignity not just intact but amplified. The entire studio fell into stunned silence. Producers frantically signaled from behind the cameras. The other hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances, desperately wishing they could be anywhere else. And the audience, they sat riveted, watching a masterclass in how to handle a hostile interviewer with the kind of grace and precision that only comes from decades of experience in far more challenging situations than this. Little did anyone know that what began as a routine Tuesday morning interview would transform into a legendary moment of television history. What started as Joy Behar's attempt to score cheap points would end with her professional reputation in tatters. And what Joy mistakenly believed would be an easy target, an elderly actress promoting her latest project, would reveal itself to be something far more formidable. A force of nature who had simply been waiting for someone foolish enough to wake her up. The warning signs were there from the beginning. Anyone who knew Jane Fonda's history, anyone familiar with her decades of activism and her refusal to be intimidated by anyone, should have recognized what was about to happen. But Joy Behar, in her arrogance and desperation for viral moments, missed every single one. She ignored the cardinal rule of journalism, know your subject, and she was about to pay a devastating price for that ignorance. The calm before the storm. It started like any other Tuesday morning at The View. The familiar set gleamed under the studio lights. The audience settled into their seats with the anticipation of another lively discussion. Camera operators checked their equipment, while sound engineers adjusted their levels. Behind the scenes, producers reviewed their notes, confident they had another successful show lined up. The energy was routine, professional, almost boring in its predictability. Then Jane Fonda arrived. She swept onto the set with the kind of elegant confidence that only comes from spending more than 60 years in the spotlight. At 86 years old, she looked stunning, in a crisp white blazer that seemed to glow under the studio lights. Her silver hair was styled to perfection, framing a face that had graced countless magazine covers and movie screens. But it was her posture that really told the story, the straight back, the steady gait, the way she commanded space simply by walking through it. This was a woman who had nothing left to prove to anyone. The audience erupted in applause as she made her entrance, their admiration palpable and genuine. Here was living Hollywood royalty, a woman who had survived every era of American entertainment and emerged not just intact but triumphant. She settled into the guest chair with practiced grace, crossing her legs and offering a warm smile to the hosts and audience alike. "Welcome back to The View, Jane," Whoopi Goldberg said with genuine warmth in her voice. There was clear respect in her tone, an acknowledgement that this guest was something special. "It's always such a pleasure to have you here." "Thank you for having me," Jane replied, her voice carrying that distinctive quality that had captivated audiences for decades. "It's wonderful to be back." The opening moments felt pleasant, almost convivial. Jane exchanged pleasantries with the hosts, laughed at a joke, complimented the set. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But those who knew the show well, those familiar with its dynamics and patterns, might have noticed something unusual. Joy Behar sat unusually quiet in her chair, her expression unreadable, her body language suggesting someone waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. She wasn't participating in the warm welcome. She wasn't joining in the friendly banter. She was watching, calculating, loading up her ammunition for what she clearly believed would be her moment to shine. Little did she know she was about to make the biggest mistake of her television career. The trap was being set, though Jane Fonda couldn't have known it yet. Behind Joy's forced smile and patient waiting lurked a series of gotcha questions, designed not to inform viewers but to create conflict. She had decided before Jane even walked through the door that this interview would be confrontational, that she would hold Jane accountable, that she would expose what she saw as hypocrisy. She had her narrative already written. She just needed Jane to cooperate by crumbling under the pressure. What Joy failed to understand, what she would learn in the most humiliating way possible, was that Jane Fonda didn't crumble. Not for studio executives who tried to control her. Not for prosecutors who tried to intimidate her. Not for mobs who called her a traitor. And certainly not for a talk show host with delusions of journalistic grandeur. The ambush begins. Before Jane could even settle comfortably into her seat, before the interview had truly begun, Joy Behar struck with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. "So Jane, I have to ask you about something that's been bothering me," Joy said, her voice dripping with false concern and barely concealed aggression. "You've been very vocal about climate change and activism, but don't you think it's a bit hypocritical coming from someone who spent decades flying around in private jets and living in massive mansions?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the atmosphere in an instant. The temperature in the studio dropped. You could feel it, that sudden shift from warmth to ice, from welcome to hostility. The other hosts exchanged glances, their eyes widening slightly in discomfort. This wasn't the agreed-upon line of questioning. This wasn't how you treated a legendary guest. This was an ambush, pure and simple, and everyone in the studio recognized it for what it was. Everyone except Joy, apparently, who sat back in her chair with an expression of smug satisfaction, clearly pleased with herself for landing what she thought was a devastating opening blow. Jane Fonda's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The warm smile faded, replaced by something more measured, more careful. Her eyes, those famous eyes that had conveyed so much emotion on screen, narrowed slightly as she processed what had just happened. But her voice, when she spoke, remained steady, controlled, professional. "Well, Joy, I think that's an interesting way to start an interview," Jane said, each word carefully chosen, weighted with meaning that anyone paying attention could decode. This was a warning shot. A gentle one, but a warning nonetheless. "I've been transparent about my past and the changes I've made in my lifestyle. I've reduced my carbon footprint significantly and used my platform to raise awareness about climate issues." It was a perfectly reasonable response, measured and factual. A good interviewer would have followed up with questions about those changes, about the climate work Jane was doing now, about how people could make similar transitions. A good interviewer would have used this as an opening for an informative conversation. Joy Behar was not a good interviewer. She leaned forward in her chair, her voice getting louder, more aggressive, emboldened by what she mistook for a defensive response. "But come on, Jane. You can't just say you've changed and expect everyone to forget about your lavish lifestyle. You're telling regular people to make sacrifices while you live in luxury. Don't you see the problem with that?" The audience began to murmur, sensing that something was going wrong, that the pleasant morning show atmosphere was curdling into something uncomfortable and hostile. Some shifted in their seats. Others exchanged confused glances. This wasn't what they had come to see. Jane Fonda's eyes narrowed further, and for just a moment, everyone in that studio could see the fire that had made her such a formidable presence for 6 decades. The steel beneath the grace. The fighter beneath the elegant exterior. "Joy, I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here," Jane said, her voice still calm but now edged with something sharp, something dangerous. "Are you interviewing me about my current work, or are you trying to create drama for your show? Because if it's the latter, I think you're going about it the wrong way." Joy's face flushed red. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The elderly actress was supposed to stammer, to get defensive, to provide sound bites that could be clipped and shared. Instead, she was pushing back, questioning Joy's motives, refusing to play the game. "I'm just asking the questions that viewers want answered," Joy said, her voice taking on a defensive edge, even as she tried to maintain her aggressive posture. "I'm being honest here." "No, Joy," Jane interrupted, her voice gaining strength, gaining authority with each word. "You're being rude and confrontational. There's a difference between honest journalism and what you're doing right now." The other host sat in stunned silence as the two women faced off. Sunny Hostin looked like she wanted to intervene but couldn't figure out how. Sarah Haynes fidgeted with her notes, her discomfort visible in every movement. Whoopi Goldberg's expression was unreadable, but her body language, the way she sat forward slightly, the tension in her shoulders suggested she was preparing to step in if things escalated further. They were about to escalate much, much further. Crossing the line, Joy Behar, feeling cornered and desperate to regain control of an interview that was slipping away from her, made the catastrophic decision to double down instead of backing off. "I'm sorry if you can't handle tough questions, Jane," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But this is The View. We don't do softball interviews here." That comment was the spark that ignited Jane Fonda's fury. She sat up straighter in her chair, her entire posture transforming from relaxed guest to commanding presence. Her eyes blazed with an intensity that reminded everyone watching why she had been such a force on screen, why directors had fought to work with her, why she had won 2 Academy Awards. This was Jane Fonda unleashed, and it was terrifying to behold. Tough questions? Jane's voice was sharp now, cutting through the air like a blade through silk. "Joy, you call that journalism? You ambushed me with poorly researched accusations without giving me a chance to properly respond. That's not tough journalism. That's tabloid sensationalism." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Jane wasn't finished. Not even close. "And furthermore," Jane continued, her voice gaining momentum, building in power, "if you had done even basic research before this interview, you would know that I've been living in a smaller home for years. I've eliminated private jet travel from my personal life, and I've donated millions to environmental causes." "But you didn't bother to check any of that, did you?" The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. The camera operators held their positions, frozen, afraid to miss a second of what was unfolding. In the control room, producers were frantically signaling, trying to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. Joy Behar looked genuinely shocked. She had expected an easy target, an elderly actress who would wilt under aggressive questioning. Instead, she had awakened something far more formidable, and she was completely unprepared for it. She stammered for a moment, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. "Well, I think our viewers deserve to know about these contradictions," she said weakly, grasping at straws. Jane leaned back in her chair, and a slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just cornered its prey and was taking a moment to savor the inevitability of what came next. "What our viewers deserve, Joy, is honest, respectful dialogue, not whatever this performance is supposed to be." The word performance hit Joy like a physical blow. Her face went from red to pale in seconds. She looked around the table desperately, searching for support from her co-hosts, for someone to jump in and help her. But they all seemed to be avoiding eye contact, leaving her to face Jane Fonda's wrath alone. "I don't know what you're implying," Joy said, her voice getting defensive and higher pitched with each word. "I'm not implying anything," Jane replied with icy precision. "I'm stating it directly. You're performing right now, trying to create conflict where none needs to exist. It's beneath both of us." Joy Behar was clearly rattled now. She had started this interview thinking she could intimidate a Hollywood legend. Instead, she was being systematically dismantled by someone who had decades of experience dealing with much tougher opponents than a daytime television host. "Look, Jane," Joy tried again, desperation creeping into her voice. "I'm just trying to hold you accountable for your actions." Jane Fonda let out a small laugh. It was more condescending than amused, dripping with the kind of contempt that only comes from facing something so far beneath you that it's almost pitiable. "Hold me accountable?" Jane's eyebrows arched perfectly. "Joy, you're a talk show host, not a prosecutor. And even if you were, you'd need to have your facts straight before you started making accusations. The point of no return." The tension in the studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of Joy Behar's humiliation as Jane Fonda continued her systematic dismantling. Behind the cameras, crew members exchanged wide-eyed glances. This wasn't just an awkward moment anymore. This was a complete meltdown, and they were witnessing television history. Whoopi Goldberg finally decided to step in, sensing that Joy was drowning, and the interview was spiraling completely out of control. "Maybe we should move on to talking about your new project, Jane." But Joy Behar, now thoroughly embarrassed and desperate to save face, made the worst possible decision of her entire career. Instead of taking the lifeline Whoopi had thrown her, Instead of gracefully moving on and salvaging what little dignity she had left, she decided to go even harder. "No, wait," Joy said, holding up her hand with what she probably thought was authority, but looked more like desperation. "I think we need to address this properly, Jane. You've made a career out of being controversial. From your time in Vietnam to your various political stances, you've never shied away from stirring the pot. So why are you so sensitive now when someone questions you?" The audacity of that statement left everyone speechless for a moment. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath. The audience gasped collectively. The other hosts looked horrified. Even the camera operators, trained professionals who had seen countless awkward moments, seemed to freeze in shock at what Joy had just said. Jane Fonda's expression went from annoyed to genuinely angry. She had been trying to keep things civil, trying to give Joy opportunities to back down gracefully. But Joy had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She had invoked Vietnam, had dismissed decades of complicated history, with a flippant comment designed to wound. Sensitive? Jane's voice was dangerously quiet now, the kind of quiet that's far more threatening than any shout could be. "Joy, you clearly don't understand the difference between being controversial and being ignorant. What you just said proves that you have no idea what you're talking about." But Joy, emboldened by what she mistakenly thought was momentum, by the delusion that she was finally landing blows, pressed forward into what would become her complete destruction. "I'm talking about your anti-war protests, your comments about American soldiers," Joy said, her voice rising. "You can't just rewrite history, Jane." The studio fell dead silent. Even the crew behind the cameras seemed to stop moving. Every eye was fixed on Jane Fonda, waiting to see how she would respond to this nuclear-level provocation. The air crackled with tension so intense it was almost visible. Jane Fonda sat perfectly still for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had a steel edge that could have cut glass. "Joy, I'm going to give you one chance to retract that statement and apologize, because what you just said is not only factually incorrect, it's deliberately inflammatory and disrespectful to both me and to the veterans I've worked with for decades." This was the moment. The point of no return. If Joy had any sense, any professional instinct, any basic human decency, she would have taken this off-ramp. She would have apologized, backed down, moved on. Instead, in her arrogance and desperation, she made yet another catastrophic mistake. "I don't need to apologize for stating facts," Joy said, her voice shaking slightly but still defiant. "Your actions during Vietnam are well documented." The eruption. Jane Fonda stood up slowly from her chair. The movement was deliberate, controlled, powerful. For a moment, it looked like she might walk off the set entirely, and the producers in the control room held their breath, already calculating the damage such a walkout would cause. But instead, Jane turned to face Joy directly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had faced down much more formidable opponents than a talk show host having a public meltdown. "Facts?" Jane's voice was controlled, but deadly serious. Every word landed with the weight of absolute certainty. "Let me give you some facts, Joy. I spent 2 years visiting wounded veterans in hospitals. I've worked with veteran organizations for over 50 years. I've apologized repeatedly for any pain my actions caused. And I've dedicated significant portions of my life to supporting our troops. But you wouldn't know any of that because you didn't bother to research before you opened your mouth." Joy's face was now completely pale. She was realizing too late that she had stepped into quicksand, but instead of stopping, she kept struggling and making it worse. "Well, that may be true, but the perception is still there," Joy stammered weakly. "The perception?" Jane's eyebrows shot up, and the contempt in her expression was withering. "Joy, you're not reporting on perception. You're creating it. You're spreading misinformation and then hiding behind the excuse that it's what people think." Sarah Haynes finally found her voice and tried desperately to salvage the situation. "Maybe we should take a commercial break." But Jane Fonda held up her hand, silencing the attempted intervention with nothing more than a gesture. "No. I think we should finish this conversation. Joy started it, so let's see it through." Joy looked like a deer caught in headlights. She had clearly expected Jane to be an easy target, an elderly actress who would crumble under aggressive questioning. Instead, she had awakened a force of nature who was now systematically destroying her credibility in front of millions of viewers, and there was no escape. "Joy," Jane continued, her voice building in intensity. You have a platform that reaches millions of people every day. With that platform comes responsibility. You can't just throw around accusations and half-truths because you think it makes for good television. I wasn't throwing around accusations, Joy protested weakly, but even she didn't sound convinced anymore. Yes, you were, Jane shot back immediately, not giving Joy even a second to recover. From the moment I sat down, you've been making statements without basis, asking loaded questions, and now you're trying to relitigate history that you clearly don't understand. This isn't journalism, Joy. This is a hit job. The other hosts looked mortified. Sunny Hostin was staring at her hands, her discomfort written across her entire body. Whoopi looked like she was calculating how to end this disaster as quickly as possible. Sarah seemed to be in shock, her earlier attempts at intervention forgotten, as she watched the systematic destruction of her colleague. Joy, now completely out of her depth and drowning in her own mistakes, made one final desperate attempt to regain control. I think you're overreacting, Jane. This is just a normal interview. That comment was the final straw. Jane Fonda let out a laugh that was pure disbelief, tinged with contempt so profound it seemed to fill the entire studio. Normal? Jane shook her head slowly, and the gesture somehow conveyed more disappointment than 1,000 words could. Joy, in a normal interview, the host prepares by researching their guest. They ask thoughtful questions designed to inform their audience. They listen to the answers and follow up appropriately. You've done none of that. I did prepare, Joy said defensively, but her voice was weak now, defeated. No, you didn't, Jane replied with absolute finality. If you had prepared, you would know that I've spent the last decade working on climate documentaries, that I've been arrested multiple times for protesting environmental destruction, that I've put my money where my mouth is, by funding renewable energy projects. But instead of asking me about any of that meaningful work, you chose to ambush me with tabloid-level gossip. Joy's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She had no response because Jane Fonda was absolutely right, and everyone in the studio knew it. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hum of the cameras and the collective held breath of 200 people watching a professional execution. The final devastation. And another thing, Jane continued, her voice gaining momentum, rolling over Joy like an unstoppable force. Your approach isn't just unprofessional, it's lazy. You could have had a fascinating conversation about the intersection of entertainment and activism, about how Hollywood has changed over the decades, about the challenges facing older women in the industry. Instead, you chose to create fake controversy because you think conflict equals good television. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Some were nodding in agreement with Jane, their faces showing clear approval of how she was handling this assault. Others looked uncomfortable witnessing such a thorough professional dismantling, but no one could look away. Joy finally managed to find her voice again, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. I was just trying to. No, Joy, Jane said, cutting her off with surgical precision. You were trying to score cheap points at my expense. There's a huge difference. The weight of Jane's words settled over the studio like a heavy blanket. Joy Behar looked smaller somehow, physically diminished, deflated, and defeated. She had started this interview thinking she was going to expose hypocrisy, and instead she had exposed her own lack of preparation and professionalism in the most public way possible. Furthermore, Jane continued, clearly not finished with her devastating critique. The way you've conducted this interview says more about you than it does about me. You've shown your viewers that you're more interested in creating drama than in having meaningful conversations with your guests. Joy tried one more time to defend herself, opening her mouth to speak, but Jane simply tilted her head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to be both elegant and utterly condescending. Joy, there's a difference between tough questions and rude behavior. Tough questions are well-researched, relevant, and asked with respect. What you've been doing is just being combative for the sake of being combative. The silence that followed Jane's words was deafening. Joy Behar sat frozen, clearly struggling to process the fact that she had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by her guest. But Jane Fonda wasn't finished. She had decades of experience dealing with hostile interviews, difficult directors, and challenging situations, and she was about to use every bit of that experience to deliver a final blow that would end this confrontation once and for all. You know what the real tragedy is here, Joy? Jane said, her voice now calm but still carrying that underlying steel that made every word land with devastating impact. You had an opportunity to have a real conversation with someone who has lived through 7 decades of American history, who has seen the entertainment industry evolve, who has been on the front lines of social movements. Instead, you chose to waste everyone's time with this performance. Joy's face was now completely drained of color. She looked around the table desperately, but her co-hosts were all avoiding eye contact. They had clearly decided that Joy had dug this hole herself, and they weren't going to jump in to help her climb out. "I think maybe we should move on," Joy said quietly. Her earlier bravado completely evaporated, her voice barely audible. "Oh, now you want to move on?" Jane's eyebrow arched perfectly, and the contempt in that simple gesture was more cutting than any words. "After you've spent the last 10 minutes making accusations and spreading misinformation, now you want to change the subject? That's very convenient, Joy." The audience was riveted. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong anymore. This was a masterclass in how to handle a hostile interviewer. Jane Fonda was systematically dismantling everything Joy Behar had tried to accomplish, and she was doing it with the grace and precision of someone who had been in far more challenging situations than this. "Joy, let me ask you something," Jane continued, leaning forward slightly, her eyes locked on Joy's face with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable to witness. "When you were preparing for this interview, what exactly did you hope to accomplish? Did you think you were going to expose some great hypocrisy? Did you think I would crumble under your questioning? What was your endgame here?" Joy opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was completely speechless, trapped by Jane's direct questioning with no way to escape without admitting that her entire approach had been wrong from the start. "Because from where I'm sitting," Jane went on, her voice dropping to a more conversational tone that was somehow more cutting than any shout could have been, "it looks like you invited me on your show not to have a conversation, but to use me as a prop in whatever narrative you had already decided to tell your viewers. That's not journalism, Joy. That's exploitation." The word exploitation hung in the air like a bomb. Joy's hands were visibly shaking now, as she tried to figure out how to respond to such a direct and devastating accusation. I never intended to, Joy stammered, but Jane cut her off with a gentle but firm gesture. "Joy, I want you to listen to me very carefully," Jane said, her voice taking on an almost maternal tone that somehow made her words even more cutting. "I've been doing interviews for over 60 years. I've faced hostile journalists, aggressive prosecutors, angry protesters, and hostile studio executives. You are none of those things. You're just a talk show host who thought she could score points by being rude to an elderly guest. And that's not just unprofessional, it's sad." The audience gasped audibly at Jane's use of the word sad. It was delivered with such quiet authority, with such absolute certainty, that it hit harder than any shouting could have. Joy looked like she had been physically struck, her face contorting in a mixture of shame, anger, and humiliation. The dignified exit. Whoopi Goldberg finally decided she had to intervene before things got even worse for Joy, before this public execution became even more brutal. "Jane, we really appreciate you being here, and I think maybe we should wrap up this segment." But Jane held up her hand politely, silencing even Whoopi with nothing more than a gesture. "Actually, Whoopi, I'd like to finish this thought if I may. Joy started this conversation, and I think she deserves to hear my complete response." Joy looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair, to sink through the floor and escape this nightmare. But Jane wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. "Joy, you mentioned earlier that I've been controversial throughout my career. You're absolutely right about that. But there's a crucial difference between being controversial because you're fighting for something you believe in and being controversial because you don't know how to conduct yourself professionally." Jane paused for a moment, letting that distinction sink in, letting it settle over Joy like a final judgment. "When I protested the Vietnam War, when I spoke out about women's rights, when I fought for environmental causes, I knew I would face criticism. I was prepared for it because I believed in what I was doing. But what you've done today isn't brave or principled. You've just been rude for no reason other than you thought it would make for entertaining television." Joy finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm sorry if you feel I was rude." "I don't feel you were rude, Joy," Jane replied immediately, her voice sharp with correction. "You were rude. That's not a feeling. That's a fact. And your apology would be more meaningful if you actually understood what you're apologizing for. The other hosts exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with how thoroughly Joy was being demolished, but none of them seemed willing or able to step in and help her now. The damage was done. The execution was complete. "Let me give you some advice," Jane continued, her voice now taking on the tone of a teacher addressing a student who had badly misbehaved. "The next time you have a guest on this show, try treating them with respect. Try asking questions that are designed to inform your audience rather than to create conflict. Try listening to their answers instead of waiting for your next opportunity to attack." Joy nodded mutely, clearly hoping that agreeing would make this nightmare end sooner. "And most importantly," Jane said, her voice gaining strength for her final point, "remember that your guests are human beings, not punching bags for whatever frustrations you're carrying around. We come on shows like this to have conversations, to share our experiences, to connect with audiences. We don't come here to be ambushed by hosts who haven't done their homework." The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible, a low, mechanical sound that filled the silence left by Jane's devastating words. She sat back in her chair, having delivered one of the most thorough and complete takedowns in daytime television history. Joy Behar looked absolutely destroyed, her earlier confidence replaced entirely by humiliation and regret. "Now," Jane said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that conveyed more contempt than any frown could, "would you like to ask me about my actual work, or should I assume this interview is over?" Joy looked around the table desperately, but found no help from her co-hosts. Whoopi was staring at her hands, suddenly fascinated by her own fingers. Sunny was looking at the ceiling as if divine intervention might appear there. Sarah was furiously scribbling notes that she probably wasn't actually reading, just trying to have something to do with her hands, somewhere to look that wasn't at the carnage unfolding beside her. I think we should go to commercial," Joy finally managed to say, her voice barely audible, defeated. Jane Fonda stood up gracefully, smoothing down her blazer with elegant, deliberate movements. "That's probably for the best," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the studio. "Thank you for having me, and I hope you'll consider what I've said today." And with that, she turned and walked off the set. Her exit was everything Joy's interview had not been. Dignified, controlled, powerful. She didn't storm off. She didn't slam anything, or make a scene. She simply walked away with her head held high, leaving behind a studio full of stunned silence, and one thoroughly humiliated talk show host. As the cameras cut away, and the studio lights dimmed, Joy Behar sat alone at the table looking like she had been hit by a truck. Her face was still pale, her hands still shaking slightly. She stared at the spot where Jane had been sitting, perhaps replaying the conversation in her mind, perhaps only now realizing the magnitude of what had just happened. The aftermath. In the moments after the cameras stopped rolling, the studio remained eerily quiet. The audience filed out in stunned silence, many of them shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. Some whispered to each other, already processing the incredible scene they had seen. Others simply looked dazed, overwhelmed by the intensity of what had unfolded. Behind the scenes, producers were already in emergency meetings, trying to figure out how to handle the fallout. Camera operators and crew members exchanged wide-eyed glances, knowing they had just captured something that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. This wasn't just another awkward television moment. This was history. Joy Behar had started this interview thinking she would expose Jane Fonda, thinking she would score points by asking tough questions, thinking she would create viral content through confrontation. Instead, she had exposed herself as unprepared, unprofessional, and completely out of her depth when faced with a true Hollywood legend who refused to be intimidated. What had begun as a routine Tuesday morning interview had transformed into one of the most brutal interview disasters in television history. Joy had learned, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that there's a difference between being a journalist and being a provocateur, between asking tough questions and simply being rude, between creating meaningful television and chasing cheap conflict. Jane Fonda, meanwhile, had reminded everyone why she had survived and thrived in Hollywood for over 6 decades. She had shown that grace and dignity are not the same as weakness, that wisdom comes from experience, and that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is controlled, systematic dismantling. The question that lingered in the air as the studio emptied, the question that would be debated in living rooms and on social media for days to come, was simple. Was Jane right to push back so forcefully? Did Joy deserve such a public takedown? And what does this moment say about the state of television journalism, about respect for guests, about the difference between entertainment and exploitation? One thing was certain. Joy Behar would be remembered as the host who got absolutely destroyed by an 86-year-old actress who refused to take her nonsense. And Jane Fonda would be celebrated once again as a force of nature, a woman who had faced down far more intimidating opponents than a daytime talk show host and emerged victorious every single time.